People who think their religion is supreme, an alliance between the communists and the Islamists. They see a Western society without values and say, here we take advantage. In Latin America, it's divided in two. The countries that value Christian values, where Jews can live in peace, and the countries where, little by little, the left and the Islamists are taking over.
How is it possible that people who are always preaching certain values invite people with opposite values into their countries with open doors to self destruct? That's a question I've been asking myself for a long time. And when you look around your neighborhoods, you wonder how our politicians who think differently keep bringing them in again and again. So, this is going to help us solve our guest of honor. Honestly, it's a great honor for me to have you here. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is probably a very familiar face to many of you. She was the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. You may have seen her in many media outlets. She is a special envoy for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, and she is a lawyer. And welcome to our channel, Jewish Philosophy.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for inviting me.
How do you explain that? It's so strange that, for example, the left, which has values like, I don't know, pro abortion, feminism, meaning that women have rights and freedom and there's no censorship, supposedly, how can they accept an ideology that comes to preach the exact opposite, which is Islam or its more radical side, to be much more precise?
Well, look, the thing about Islamism and communism, because today woke is a development of communism, when you look at the values of woke, that everything is centered around the oppressor and the oppressed. All of that is the first page of Marxist communist propaganda. And always, even in the 60s and 70s, there was an alliance between the communists and the Islamists. In fact, many of the Islamist countries had communism. They had adopted communism, although there has always been a kind of una alianza with communism. And woke is just the development of communism. But anyway, you ask a very good question. How is woke, which is supposed to be a movement, a philosophy, an ideology, values of freedom, values of equality, of rights, can it get in bed with Islamism, which is the opposite? It's supreme Islamism. It's a movement of supremacy of Islamism over all religions, a movement that suppresses women, a movement that kills lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people. And I think the answer is that when there is a common enemy, they forget all their values. And that common enemy, and that's, of course, a brainwashing that they've done to the woke. It's colonialism, imperialism, those are the values of communism. It's that the world of the United States is an imperialist, colonialist force. What is that? Instead of seeing Islamism for what it is, which is a colonialist, imperialist movement, there are 22 countries in the world that are Islamist. And what has happened there, they see the United States and Israel, the Jewish people, as the colonialist, imperialist, racist movement. Do they really see it that way? Or have they been convinced to see it that way? Because they hate us much more than they love the values they have.
You, in general, maybe this is a bit more of a personal question, but would you consider yourself a feminist?
Yes, I consider myself a feminist because feminism is something very clear, equal rights and opportunities for men and women. And what about the person who says, or the woman who says, or the man who says, I'm not a feminist? Are you talking about a kind of feminism that has been twisted so people don't want to be feminists? How do I explain it to you? Is feminism just a movement for equal rights? I think that as long as you believe that women and men should have the same rights, right?
Correct?
Do you think women and men should have equal opportunities?
No doubt.
So you're a feminist? What happened? For the last 30 years, the woke have taken the term feminist hostage and said no to be a feminist. You have to believe that you have to hate men and hate traditional systems of marriage and other things. That's not true. The same thing they've done to Zionism, that they've captured the term. Zionism is the liberal movement of the Jewish world to return to our homeland. That's what Zionism is. Feminism is the equality of rights between men and women. But the people who are against Zionism or the people who are against feminism have captured the term and turned it into something it is not. But they have done it very deliberately so that people say, oh, I'm not a Zionist, I'm not a feminist, but it's the same thing. They have done the same thing because the one who comes to change the order of power, it means that feminist women, traditional feminists, came to empower women. It means that there are people who are against that empowerment because it means that they lose power. And Zionism was there to empower and emancipate the Jew. There are people who don't want to empower and emancipate the Jew. What have they done? Have they gone back? Those words, both Zionism and feminism, are not dirty words. They're not words that should be opposed. But it's the same because, yes, I am a Jewish, religious, and feminist woman.
Of course. So I was asking you because there are values from the left that sometimes people are reluctant to accept. But that's not your case, right? In the broader sense of freedom and that women should also have equality, that's why it's surprising to me when people who are, let's say, the ideological or political leaders of the left act that way. Are they even aware of what's happening? That Islam actually preaches something opposite, and yet can they still form such a major alliance? Are they aware, or does their narrative simply make them prisoners of their own actions? How is this?
I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think it's just the narrative that makes them prisoners of their goals. Do they think it's better to abandon all those values? Because the highest value, the most important, the most supreme, is to overthrow imperialism and colonialism. And I always had on my Twitter, on my X, I always had feminists, Zionists, and people would write to me, you can't be a feminist if you're a Zionist. And that's called intersectionality. Intersectionality, that if you're a feminist, you can't be a Zionist. Why? Or if you're a Zionist, you can't be. It's ridiculous because they've twisted the terms so they can feel good about themselves. There's a bit of unconsciousness, but there's also a bit of extremism, just a little bit, a tiny bit of extremism. El extremismo dice, anything goes as long as we eliminate the biggest threat there is, which is colonialism, imperialism itself. If the Islamists have to violate Jewish women, that's justified too.
It's madness because it's a suicide of values.
Of course.
Okay, so that would be the Western person's perspective. What about the Islamist perspective? How would that be? So, because you explained to me that the Marxist sees the world as a struggle of oppression, but the Islamist, how does he see it? It's very simple.
He mocks. The Islamist is lying and deceiving the whole world because the Islamist is, they are people who think their religion is supreme and who believe the world must be governed by their system of laws. Islamist Sharia. The Islamist wants political Islam, like the Islamic regime in Iran. That is their ideal. Political Islamism, does that mean that governing a country by Islamist laws means they are mocking others? Because they have found that in the Western world, the values that used to exist, religion, community, and family, no longer exist. There is a vacuum, and into that vacuum came this nonsense, this silliness of wokeism. And in that vacuum of wokeism, they have taken control of that narrative. They used the weakness of the Western mind, which separated itself from religion, which was Christianity. It's separated from its religion, it's separated from its communities. They separated from religious values and other values because nothing came to replace religious values. And do you see a Western society without values? And they say, here we swing so we can take over the world with an Islamist ideology. If you talk to an Islamist, honestly, they'll tell you as soon as you listen. They say one day we are going to rule, and for Islamists, ruling means that all the rest of us are second class citizens because that's written in Sharia law. But the world still hasn't realized it. Or have they been convinced that the Jewish people or religious Christians are the racists? But the biggest racists in the world are the Islamists who think that we are not all equal.
Thank you. Do you think that everything we're seeing, because you mentioned it just like that, or what we saw, like how they're canceling Christmas now in Europe, do you think there's a way back for Europe, or have they already passed the breaking point?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I ask myself the same thing every day. Honestly, yes, because demographically they're lost. Remember that in Europe, people have one child, two children, not like here. Israel is the only organization for economic cooperation and development country, the organization for economic cooperation and development country with the most children with higher fertility than other modern and developed countries. Okay, normally there are a lot of children in countries that are a little less developed or in cultures that value having many children. Israel is a culture that values having children. Here, the richest and the poorest might have the same number of children: 3 children, 4 children, 5 children. That's how it is in Israel now. In Europe, for many years, the fertility rate has been very low, 1.5, something like that in terms of numbers. But the Muslims come and have many children, which means that demographically, they already have a huge problem. Now, it would be fine if these Muslims weren't, if not a part of them were Islamists. There are Muslims who just want their religion to live in peace, go home, work, and be with their children. Okay, then there are the Islamists who want political Islam as the way to govern their country or the world. The problem is that the 20% of Islamists in the world are a lot, and they are the strong part that leads. The people who don't want that, who want peace, who want to live in peace. It means that the voices we hear are the voices of the extremists, and the moderate voices are afraid to speak because they don't want anything to happen to them. And in Europe, that's very clear. The mosques that have radicalized Muslims, who were peaceful Muslims and wanted peace, have radicalized them. Immigrants, ironically, are becoming radicalized in Europe, not in Syria. And the countries they come from, they come to escape, they arrive in Europe, and they are radicalized in the mosque. And some governments in Europe, just to avoid appearing to be Islamophobic, which is a word that doesn't really mean anything, but just so they won't be called racists, they let them do whatever they want. They let them keep radicalizing. They let them keep bothering synagogues, churches, and they don't get involved because they're afraid of being called racists. So here we have a terrible mix, a cocktail of weak left-wing governments and leaders, a demographic of Europeans that's becoming more limited, and a demographic of Muslims that's growing. And as I said, there's no leadership for the European values they want to preserve, because it seems like they've given up on their values. They've withdrawn from their European values.
And Fleur, to wrap up, I want to tell the audience that Fleur is present on all social networks, from Facebook, Instagram, her Twitter, as she mentioned. I'll put a link in the description so you can find her. And Fleur also knows quite a few languages and is familiar with many cultures as well. And what you've mentioned to us, the context is Europe and maybe in some aspects the United States. But for the audience watching us who are all across the spectrum, Latin America, how would this be relevant to them? I mean, why would someone in, let's say, Peru or in Latin America in general care about what's happening in Europe?
It's very relevant because in Latin America, there are already Islamists with very ambitious plans. You can see it in Venezuela, where Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the networks of that political Islamism we're talking about, are present. In Latin America, it's divided into two. The countries that value Christian values, where Jewish people can live in peace, and where little by little the left and the Islamists are taking over many countries. You can see it in Venezuela now. You can see it with Lula in Brazil. Chile has now changed its government, but Chile was also doing very badly. Colombia is in a terrible state, and there are many countries in Latin America where, because of the oil in Venezuela and other interests, the Islamists are already there and they're already deceiving people. They control many resources, and it's dangerous for Latin America. Very dangerous.
Well, Fleur, thank you for explaining all of this to us. I think that in Latin America, it's still quite early, so they can still wake up. They can see how to learn from their neighbor and know what measures to take. And I believe that being on the right side of history is being on Israel's side precisely because Israel is that torch that lights the way forward.
Fleur,
Thank you, Fleur, for participating, and thanks to everyone who listened.